standing outside the Charleston Harbor Country Club in my only decent dress, watching my sister's wedding guests stream past the security checkpoint. I never imagined that in 2 hours I'd be sitting at the head table while a Navy captain publicly acknowledged my service. But sometimes the most unexpected moments reveal truths we've buried so deep we almost forget they exist. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The invitation never came. Not that I expected it to, really. My sister Rebecca and I hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not since our father's funeral, when she made it crystal clear that my military career had robbed our family of enough precious moments. 22 years in the Navy, she said, and for what? To miss Dad's final months while I was deployed in the Pacific, chasing some misguided sense of duty that meant more to me than blood. I found out about the wedding the same way most people discover uncomfortable truths these days, through social media. A college friend had tagged me in a photo from Rebecca's engagement party, complete with the caption, "Can't wait for the June wedding." The date was circled in elegant script on a save-the-date card visible in the background. June 15th. The Charleston Harbor Country Club. Black tie optional. For weeks I told myself I didn't care. Rebecca had made her choice, and I had made mine. The Navy had been my life, my identity, my purpose. From the moment I stepped off the bus at Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, at 22 years old, I knew I had found my calling. The structure, the mission, the brotherhood, it filled a void I didn't even know existed. My parents never understood. Dad, a small-town insurance agent in Greenville, South Carolina, had hoped I'd follow a more traditional path. Maybe law school, or business. Something that would keep me closer to home. Mom worried constantly, especially after 9/11 when my deployments became more frequent and more dangerous. But they supported me in their quiet way, displaying my promotion photos on the mantle and telling their friends about their daughter, the Navy officer. Rebecca was different. 8 years younger, she had grown up watching me leave, birthday parties I missed because of training exercises, Christmas mornings cut short by emergency deployments, high school graduation where my empty chair sat prominently in the front row while I coordinated maritime security operations somewhere in the Arabian Gulf. She never said anything directly, not until Dad got sick. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed on a Tuesday in October. The doctors gave him 6 months. I was in Hawaii then, serving as executive officer aboard the USS Columbia, and I requested emergency leave immediately. But there was a situation developing with Chinese naval activities near Taiwan, and my commanding officer needed me to see our deployment through. It would only be another month, he promised. 6 weeks at most. Dad died on a Thursday morning in January. I was somewhere in the South China Sea, leading a task force through what would later be classified as one of the most significant naval operations of my career. I didn't find out until 8 hours later, when the communication came through official channels. By then, Rebecca had already made the funeral arrangements, already chosen the casket, already written the obituary that mentioned his loving wife and devoted younger daughter, with a brief note that his elder daughter was, quote, serving overseas. The funeral was held 3 days later. I caught the first flight I could, still wearing my dress blues because I hadn't had time to pack civilian clothes. I arrived at the cemetery as they were lowering the casket, dirt already scattered across the mahogany surface. Rebecca stood beside Mom, holding her elbow, both of them dressed in black. Neither of them looked at me as I approached. After the service, as people filtered back to their cars, Rebecca finally spoke. "He asked for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day for the last 2 weeks. He kept saying you'd make it in time, that the Navy would send you home. Mom told him you were coming, right up until the end." I wanted to explain about the operation, about the strategic importance of what we were doing, about how my absence wasn't a choice but a duty. But looking at my sister's face, streaked with tears and something harder than grief, I realized that explanations wouldn't bridge the gap that had opened between us. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I wanted to be here." "But you weren't," Rebecca replied. "You never are." That was the last conversation we had. Mom tried to mediate for a while, inviting us both to Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas Eve service. But the awkwardness was palpable. Rebecca would excuse herself when I called, and I stopped trying to reach out after a few months. Mom passed away 2 years later. A heart attack, sudden and merciless. And even then, Rebecca and I maintained our distance. We sat on opposite sides of the church, exchanged pleasantries at the reception, and went our separate ways. I retired from the Navy 6 months after Mom's funeral. 28 years of service, rising from ensign to rear admiral, commanding ships and task forces and ultimately overseeing strategic operations across the Pacific Fleet. It was a career that any naval officer would be proud of, marked by commendations and achievements, and the respect of my peers. But standing in Mom's empty house, sorting through photos that chronicled a lifetime of missed moments, I wondered what I had actually accomplished. Retirement didn't suit me. I tried consulting work for a few months, advising defense contractors on maritime security protocols, but the passion wasn't there. I moved to a small coastal town in North Carolina, bought a house near the water, and attempted to discover who I was without the uniform that had defined me for nearly 3 decades. The days blended together. I read books, took long walks on the beach, and tried to convince myself that I was enjoying the peace and quiet. But the truth was, I felt completely lost. The Navy had given me purpose, structure, identity. Without it, I was just a middle-aged woman with a distinguished service record and no family to speak of. That's when I saw the engagement announcement. Rebecca's smiling face beside a man I didn't recognize. Tall, blonde, wearing a polo shirt and khakis. The caption identified him as Dr. Marcus Whitman, a pediatric surgeon at Charleston General Hospital. The wedding was planned for June, the announcement said, and would be held at the Charleston Harbor Country Club. I stared at the photo for a long time. My sister looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. Her left hand was positioned prominently in the shot, showing off a substantial, diamond engagement ring. She had chosen a life I had never wanted: marriage, stability, the kind of domestic happiness that requires you to be present, to show up, to put someone else's needs before your own ambitions. Part of me was genuinely pleased for her. Rebecca deserved happiness, deserved a partner who would be there for the important moments, who wouldn't disappear for months at a time chasing abstract concepts of duty and honor. But another part of me, a part one wasn't proud of, felt a familiar stab of isolation, the same feeling I'd experienced watching my shipmates' families greet them at homecoming ceremonies while I walked down the gangplank alone. I debated whether to send a wedding gift. It seemed like the appropriate gesture, a way to acknowledge the milestone without inserting myself into a celebration where I clearly wasn't wanted. But every time I started to browse wedding registries online, I found myself closing the browser tab. What would I even choose? Kitchen appliances for the domestic life I had never understood? China patterns for dinner parties I would never attend? Instead, I did nothing. I told myself it was better this way, that Rebecca deserved a wedding day uncomplicated by family drama and unresolved grief. She had made her feelings clear 3 years ago, and I had to respect that. Some wounds don't heal, and some relationships can't be repaired. But as June 15th approached, I found myself thinking about the wedding constantly. I imagined Rebecca in a white dress, walking down the aisle of some elegant chapel, surrounded by friends and family who had been part of her life in ways I never was. I wondered if she would mention our parents during the ceremony, if she would save a moment to acknowledge the people who couldn't be there to see her happiness. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early and drove to Charleston. I told myself I was just going for a day trip, maybe visit the historic district, walk through the market, get some lunch at a seafood restaurant. But as the afternoon wore on, I found myself driving past the Charleston Harbor Country Club, a sprawling white building with manicured gardens and a perfect view of the harbor. Cars were already arriving, guests in formal attire walking toward the main entrance. I parked across the street and watched from a distance, feeling like a stalker but unable to drive away. I recognized a few faces from childhood, family friends, distant relatives, people who had known me before I became Admiral Catherine Sullivan, back when I was just Katie, Rebecca's older sister who was good at math and dreamed of seeing the world. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I got out of my car, smoothed down my navy blue dress, the only formal outfit I owned that wasn't a military uniform, and walked across the street toward the country club entrance. The security checkpoint was set up just inside the main doors, staffed by 2 young men in black suits checking names against a guest list. I approached the table with what I hoped was confidence, though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "Good evening," I said to the younger of the 2 security guards, Catherine Sullivan. He ran his finger down the list, flipped to the second page, then back to the first. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name here. Are you sure you're registered for the Whitman-Sullivan wedding?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Sullivan. Rebecca had kept Dad's name, even though she was about to take her husband's. We shared the same surname, the same bloodline, the same childhood memories, but according to this list, I didn't exist. "I'm Rebecca's sister," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There might have been some mistake with the invitation. The guard looked uncomfortable. "I'm really sorry, ma'am, but I can only admit people who are on the list. Maybe you could contact the bride or groom directly?" Behind me, other guests were starting to queue up. Well-dressed people holding proper invitations and looking increasingly impatient. I could feel their eyes on me, could imagine them whispering about the woman who couldn't even get into her own sister's wedding. "Is there a supervisor I could speak with?" I asked, though I already knew this was hopeless. Rebecca hadn't forgotten to put me on the list. She had deliberately left me off it. "Ma'am, I understand this is frustrating, but is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind me, deep and authoritative. I turned to see a man in his 50s approaching, wearing a navy dress blue uniform with captain's stripes on his sleeves. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that comes from decades of military service. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "This lady says she's the bride's sister, but she's not on the guest list," the security guard explained. The captain looked at me more carefully, his eyes taking in my posture, my bearing, the way I held myself. Something in his expression shifted, a recognition that went beyond physical features. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly formal, "could I ask your name?" "Catherine Sullivan." His eyes widened slightly. "Admiral Catherine Sullivan? Pacific Fleet Operations?" I nodded, suddenly feeling exposed. It had been months since anyone had recognized me, since anyone had known who I was beyond just another retiree trying to figure out how to fill her days. The captain stepped forward and extended his hand. "Captain James Morrison, USS Leyte Gulf. It's an honor to meet you, Admiral. I served under your operational command during the Taiwan Strait operations last year." The security guards were watching this exchange with growing confusion, clearly not understanding the significance of what was happening. But I remembered Captain Morrison now, remembered his ship's exemplary performance during one of the most challenging operations of my career. "Captain Morrison," I said, shaking his hand, "good to see you again." He turned to the security guards, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a naval officer. "Gentlemen, I can personally vouch for Admiral Sullivan. She's not only the bride's sister, but she's also one of the most distinguished officers in the history of the United States Navy." The younger guard looked between us uncertainly. "But she's not on the list." "Then the list is wrong," Captain Morrison said firmly. "Admiral Sullivan has earned the right to be anywhere she chooses to be." He turned back to me, his expression serious. "Admiral, would you allow me to escort you inside? I think there are some people who would be very interested to meet you." I hesitated. This wasn't how I had imagined this moment. Wasn't the quiet, unobtrusive entrance I had hoped for. But Captain Morrison was already offering his arm, and the security guards were stepping aside, and suddenly I was walking through the doors of the Charleston Harbor Country Club into my sister's wedding, with a Navy captain as my escort. The reception was already in full swing. The ceremony had apparently concluded, and guests were mingling in an elegant ballroom overlooking the harbor. I could see Rebecca across the room, radiant in a white dress, talking animatedly with a group of her friends. She hadn't noticed me yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. "Admiral," Captain Morrison said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but your operational leadership during the Pacific tensions was extraordinary. The way you coordinated multiple task forces while maintaining diplomatic protocols, It was a masterclass in naval strategy. I felt a flush of pride, the first genuine positive emotion I'd experienced in months. Thank you, Captain. Your ship's performance was exemplary. I actually have some colleagues here who would be thrilled to meet you, he continued. There are several active duty officers attending the wedding. Dr. Whitman, the groom, apparently has connections throughout the military medical community. As he spoke, I began to notice other uniforms scattered throughout the crowd. A Marine Corps major talking with what appeared to be a Coast Guard lieutenant. A Navy commander in dress white standing near the bar. This wasn't just a civilian wedding. It was a gathering that included members of the military community I had served with for nearly 3 decades. Admiral Sullivan? I turned to find a young woman in a Navy dress uniform approaching us. She was probably in her early 30s, with the confident bearing of someone who had found her calling early in life. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, USS Fitzgerald, she said, extending her hand. I just wanted to say, ma'am, that your leadership during the humanitarian mission in the Philippines last year was inspiring. My ship was part of the Disaster Relief Task Force. Another memory surfaced. The Philippines operation had been particularly challenging, requiring us to coordinate naval assets for earthquake relief while maintaining readiness for potential regional threats. It had been one of my final major operations before retirement. Thank you, Commander Chen. How is Captain Rodriguez doing? Very well, ma'am. He speaks of you often, always with the highest respect. As we talked, I became aware that other people were beginning to notice our conversation. Guests were turning to look at us, some with curiosity, others with what appeared to be recognition. The sight of 3 naval officers in dress uniforms was apparently drawing attention. Captain Morrison must have noticed as well. Admiral, would you like me to introduce you to some of the other military personnel here? I think you'd find the conversation interesting. I glanced across the room toward Rebecca, who was still engaged with her friends, still unaware of my presence. Part of me wanted to approach her immediately, to get the inevitable confrontation over with. But another part of me, the part that had been starved for meaningful connection, was drawn to the prospect of talking with fellow service members, people who understood the world I had inhabited for so long. I'd like that, I said. What followed was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. As Captain Morrison led me through the reception, introducing me to various officers and their spouses, I found myself at the center of a series of conversations that I hadn't experienced since my retirement. These weren't just polite social exchanges. They were discussions with people who knew my work, who had been affected by my decisions, who understood the complexities of military service in ways that civilians often couldn't. A Marine Corps colonel told me about how my inter-service coordination protocols had improved joint operations in the Middle East. A Coast Guard captain described how my maritime security initiatives had been adopted throughout the service. A Navy chaplain mentioned that he had used my leadership philosophy in his own work with military families. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the retired officer struggling to find purpose. Not the estranged sister haunted by missed opportunities. But Admiral Catherine Sullivan, a leader who had made a difference in the lives of the men and women who served under her command. But even as I enjoyed these conversations, I remained acutely aware of Rebecca's presence across the room. She was moving through the crowd now, greeting guests, accepting congratulations, playing the role of the radiant bride with natural grace. She still hadn't seen me, but I knew that moment was approaching. Admiral, Captain Morrison said quietly, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you planning to speak with your sister this evening? I looked at him, surprised by the question. I'm not sure. We haven't spoken in several years. I'm not even sure she wants me here. Ma'am, if I may, he said carefully, family relationships can be complicated, especially in military families. But from what I've observed tonight, your presence here means something to people. Your service meant something. Maybe it's time your sister understood that. Before I could respond, I heard a voice behind me that made my blood run cold. Katie? I turned slowly to find Rebecca standing about 10 feet away, her face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been anger. She was even more beautiful than in her engagement photos, her dark hair swept up in an elegant style, her wedding dress highlighting the confidence that had always been her defining characteristic. Hyphens. Hello, Rebecca, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The conversation around us gradually died away as people sensed the tension. Captain Morrison and the other officers stepped back slightly, giving us space while remaining close enough to provide support if needed. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca asked, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of emotion I couldn't quite identify. "I wanted to see you get married," I said simply. "I know I wasn't invited, but—" "No," she interrupted. "You weren't invited, and there was a reason for that." The silence stretched between us, filled with 3 years of unspoken resentment and unresolved grief. I was acutely aware of the other guests watching us, some pretending to continue their conversations while clearly straining to hear what was happening. "Rebecca," I began, but she held up her hand. "Not here," she said firmly. "Not at my wedding. If you want to talk, we can talk later, but not here." She turned to walk away, but Captain Morrison stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Whitman," he said respectfully, "I hope you don't mind my interrupting, but I wanted you to know that your sister is a true American hero. Her service to our country has been extraordinary." Rebecca paused, looking at Captain Morrison with surprise. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Captain James Morrison, United States Navy. I had the honor of serving under Admiral Sullivan's command. She saved countless lives through her leadership and dedication." "Admiral?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "Your sister reached the rank of Rear Admiral before her retirement," Captain Morrison continued. "She was one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Pacific Fleet. Her operational expertise and leadership were legendary throughout the service." I saw something shift in Rebecca's expression, a flicker of surprise that cut through the anger. She had known I was successful in the Navy, but I had never shared the details of my career with my family. The distance between us had grown so gradually that there had never been opportunities for those conversations. "I didn't know," she said quietly, looking at me with new eyes. "There's a lot you don't know," I replied, not meaning it as a criticism, but as a simple statement of fact. The moment stretched between us, heavy with implication. Then Rebecca's new husband appeared at her side, a tall, kind-looking man who immediately assessed the situation with the calm competence of someone accustomed to crisis management. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice gentle but alert. "Marcus," Rebecca said, "this is my sister, Catherine. Catherine, this is my husband, Dr. Marcus Whitman." Marcus extended his hand to me, his grip firm and warm. "Catherine, I've heard so much about you. I'm glad you could make it." His words were clearly meant to diffuse the tension, but I saw Rebecca's sharp look at him. They had obviously discussed me, and his welcoming tone suggested that he had been more open to my presence than she had been. "Congratulations," I said to him. "You're getting a wonderful woman." "I know," he replied with a smile. "I'm the lucky one." Captain Morrison chose that moment to address the group more broadly. "Dr. Whitman, I hope you don't mind, but several of us have been sharing stories about Admiral Sullivan's distinguished service. She's something of a legend in naval circles." Other military personnel began to gather around us, and I found myself at the center of an impromptu receiving line. Officers and their spouses approached to shake my hand, share brief stories about how my service had affected their careers, express their gratitude for my leadership during various operations. It was overwhelming and humbling at the same time. I had spent months in retirement feeling forgotten, feeling like my career had ended with a whimper rather than a bang. But surrounded by these men and women who remembered my service, who valued my contributions, I began to remember why I had chosen the Navy in the first place. Through it all, I was aware of Rebecca watching from a few feet away, her expression unreadable. She was seeing me in a context she had never experienced, hearing about aspects of my life that she had never known existed. The sister she remembered was the one who missed family gatherings and left early for deployments. This Admiral Sullivan was a stranger to her. The evening continued in this surreal fashion, with me moving between conversations with military personnel and stolen glances at my sister. The wedding reception proceeded around us. Toasts were made, dinner was served, the bride and groom had their first dance. But I felt like I was existing in a parallel universe, simultaneously part of the celebration and completely separate from it. It wasn't until the band began playing slower songs and the formal program wound down that Rebecca approached me again. The crowd had thinned somewhat, with older guests beginning to make their departures and younger ones settling in for what would probably be a long night of dancing. "Katie," she said quietly, "could we talk?" "Privately?" I nodded, following her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where we could speak without being overheard. The last hour had been emotionally exhausting, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for the conversation that I knew was coming. "I need to understand something," Rebecca began, her voice carefully controlled. "All those people, all those stories about your service, is that really who you were? Are you really this Admiral Sullivan they're talking about?" "Yes," I said simply, "that's who I was." "Why didn't you ever tell us? Why didn't you ever share any of that with Mom and Dad? With me?" It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself for months. Because I didn't think you would understand. Because every time I tried to talk about my career, about what I was doing, the conversation always came back to why I wasn't home more often. It was easier to just not talk about it. "But Dad would have been so proud," Rebecca said, her voice breaking slightly. "He always worried that you were just following orders somewhere, not making a difference. If he had known what you were really doing, what you had accomplished." "He did know," I said quietly. "Not the details, maybe, but he knew I was trying to serve something bigger than myself. He understood that, even if he didn't always agree with my choices." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Around us, the wedding celebration continued, but we were existing in our own private bubble of long overdue honesty. "I've been so angry at you," she said finally. "For missing Dad's funeral, for not being there when Mom died, for choosing the Navy over family. But listening to those people tonight, hearing what you did, what you accomplished, I'm starting to understand that maybe it wasn't a choice between the Navy and family. Maybe it was a choice between different kinds of service. I made mistakes," I admitted. "I should have tried harder to bridge the gap between my two worlds. I should have found ways to help you understand what my service meant without making you feel like you were competing with the Navy for my attention." "And I should have tried harder to understand," Rebecca replied. "I was so focused on what you weren't giving us that I never really considered what you were giving everyone else." We stood there in the relative quiet, two sisters who had spent 3 years estranged from each other, finally beginning to understand the different paths that had led us to this moment. The wedding reception continued around us, but for the first time in years, I felt like Rebecca and I were actually seeing each other clearly. "I'm sorry I didn't invite you," she said eventually. "I was still so hurt, so angry. I thought your being here would just remind me of everything we had lost." "I'm sorry I didn't try harder to reach out," I replied. "I thought you were better off without me, that my presence would just cause more pain." "We were both wrong," Rebecca said with a small smile, "but maybe we can be right going forward." It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much time had passed, too many words had been left unsaid for that. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall that had separated us for so long. As the evening wound down, I found myself in the unexpected position of being invited to join the family table for the final toasts. Captain Morrison had somehow arranged for an additional chair to be brought over, and I sat between Rebecca and Marcus as the best man delivered his speech about love, commitment, and the importance of chosen family. When it was time for the bride and groom to make their departure, Rebecca hugged me goodbye, the first physical contact we had shared in 3 years. "Don't disappear again," she whispered in my ear. "Promise me you won't disappear." "I promise," I said, meaning it. As I watched her and Marcus leave the reception, surrounded by well-wishers and photographers' flashes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for my relationship with Rebecca, but for my own future. The conversations with fellow service members had reminded me that my Navy career hadn't ended. It had simply evolved into something new. Captain Morrison approached me as I was preparing to leave. "Admiral, I hope you don't mind my saying, but tonight felt like a homecoming of sorts." He was right. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by people who understood and valued my service, reconnecting with my sister, I had felt more like myself than I had in months. The uniform might be retired, but the leader, the person who had dedicated her life to serving others, was still there. "Thank you," I said to him, "for everything tonight, for recognizing me, for speaking up, for helping me remember who I am." "Thank you for your service, Admiral," he replied, "and for reminding all of us why we chose to serve." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the evening's events. I had arrived at the wedding as an uninvited guest, someone who didn't belong, someone whose presence would only cause problems. I was leaving as Admiral Catherine Sullivan, a woman whose service had made a difference, whose leadership had mattered, whose story was worth telling. The reconciliation with Rebecca was just the beginning. There would be more conversations, more opportunities to rebuild the relationship that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and missed communication. But tonight had proven that it was possible, that the gulf between us could be bridged if we were both willing to try. More importantly, tonight reminded me that retirement from the Navy didn't mean retirement from service. There were other ways to lead, other ways to make a difference, other ways to honor the values that had guided me throughout my career. I wasn't just Rebecca's sister who had missed too many family gatherings. I wasn't just a retired officer struggling to find purpose. I was Admiral Catherine Sullivan, and my story was far from over. 3 weeks after Rebecca's wedding, I received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of my post-Navy life entirely. The caller identified himself as Admiral Richard Hawthorne, current commander of Naval Surface Forces Pacific, and his first words caught me completely off guard. "Admiral Sullivan, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but Captain Morrison spoke very highly of your presence at the Whitman wedding. He mentioned you might be interested in opportunities to continue serving in a civilian capacity." I was standing in my kitchen in Wilmington, North Carolina, still in my morning robe, coffee growing cold in my hands. The retirement routine I had established over the past year suddenly felt inadequate compared to the possibility of meaningful work. "Admiral Hawthorne, I appreciate Captain Morrison's recommendation, but I'm not sure what kind of opportunities you're referring to." "We have a unique situation developing," he explained. "The Navy is launching a new mentorship program for senior officers, particularly focused on leadership development for women in command positions. We need someone with your operational experience and leadership credentials to design and implement the curriculum." The conversation lasted 45 minutes, during which Admiral Hawthorne outlined a position that would allow me to use my decades of experience to shape the next generation of naval leaders. It wasn't active duty, but it was purposeful work that would honor everything I had learned during my career. "I'll need to think about it," I told him, though every instinct was screaming that this was exactly what I had been missing. "Of course. But Admiral, I should mention that Captain Morrison wasn't the only officer who spoke about your impact. Word of your attendance at the wedding has spread throughout the fleet. Officers who served under your command are requesting you specifically for this program." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring out at the Atlantic Ocean visible from my back window. For months, I had been drifting through retirement, convinced that my useful life was behind me. Now, suddenly, I was being offered a chance to matter again. The phone rang again an hour later. This time, it was Rebecca. "Katie, I've been thinking about our conversation at the wedding," she said without preamble. "I realized I don't really know anything about what you did in the Navy. I mean, I know you were important, but I don't understand how important." "Rebecca, you don't need to." "No, I do need to. Marcus has been educating me about military ranks and responsibilities. He looked up your service record online, and Katie, I had no idea. I knew you were successful, but I never understood the scope of what you accomplished." She had discovered that I had been responsible for maritime operations covering half the Pacific Ocean, that I had coordinated multinational naval exercises involving dozens of ships and thousands of personnel, that my decisions had influenced American foreign policy in ways that rarely made headlines but were crucial to national security. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she asked, echoing the question from the wedding. "Because I didn't think you wanted to hear it," I admitted. "Every time I tried to explain what I was doing, it seemed to make you more angry about my absences. It was easier to just not talk about work." "But Dad would have been fascinated," Rebecca said. "He loved history, loved hearing about important events. If he had known you were helping to shape those events." We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we had shared since before Dad's illness. Rebecca asked detailed questions about my career, about specific operations, about the challenges of being a woman in military leadership. For the first time, I felt like she was genuinely curious about my life rather than resentful of my choices. I want to learn more, she said finally. I want to understand what you did, what it meant. Maybe we could have dinner sometime and you could tell me some of these stories? I'd like that, I said, meaning it completely. The following week, I drove to Charleston to have dinner with Rebecca and Marcus. They had chosen a seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor, and as we settled into our table, I felt a nervousness I hadn't experienced since my first command briefing decades earlier. Before we start, Rebecca said, I owe you an apology, not just for not inviting you to the wedding, but for never trying to understand what your service meant. I was so focused on what I thought you owed the family that I never considered what you were giving to everyone else. Marcus nodded in agreement. Rebecca's been reading about your operations in the South China Sea. She's starting to understand the strategic importance of what you were doing. It wasn't just me, I said automatically. Military operations are team efforts. I was just one person in a much larger organization. But you were the leader, Rebecca pressed. You made the decisions that affected thousands of people. That's not something just anyone can do. Over the course of the evening, I found myself telling them stories I had never shared with family before. About coordinating disaster relief efforts in the Philippines, managing the complexities of multinational naval exercises, dealing with the diplomatic challenges of operating in contested waters. Rebecca listened with an intensity that surprised me, asking insightful questions and making connections I hadn't expected. I'm starting to understand something, she said as we finished our main courses. When you missed Dad's funeral, when you weren't there for family events, it wasn't because you didn't care about us. It was because you were caring about everyone else. That's not an excuse, I said quietly. I could have done better at balancing both responsibilities. Maybe, Rebecca agreed. But I could have done better at understanding why your other responsibilities mattered so much. Marcus had been listening to our conversation with the focused attention of someone trained in crisis management. Catherine, can I ask you something? What's retirement been like for you? Are you enjoying the change of pace? I considered lying, giving him the standard response about enjoying freedom and relaxation. But something about the evening's honesty compelled me to tell the truth. It's been difficult, I admitted. I spent 30 years with a clear sense of purpose, knowing that my decisions mattered, that my leadership affected real outcomes. In retirement, I feel irrelevant. But that's not true, Rebecca said immediately. What about that job opportunity you mentioned, the mentorship program? I had told her about Admiral Hawthorne's offer during our phone conversation, though I hadn't made a decision yet. The opportunity was compelling, but part of me worried about diving back into military-adjacent work when I was still figuring out who I was without the uniform. I'm considering it, I said, but I'm not sure I'm ready to jump back into that world. Why not? Marcus asked. From what Rebecca's told me, and from what I observed at the wedding, you clearly have knowledge and experience that could benefit other people. Isn't that what service is about? His words hit harder than I expected. For months I had been thinking about retirement as an ending, a conclusion to my useful life. But maybe it was actually a transition to a different kind of service. The program would involve developing leadership curricula for senior officers, I explained, particularly focused on helping women navigate command positions. It would be consulting work, but based at the Naval War College in Newport. That sounds perfect for you, Rebecca said. You'd be teaching other people to be effective leaders, sharing everything you learned during your career. But it would mean moving again, starting over in a new place, adapting to civilian work culture. Katie, Rebecca interrupted gently, you've been starting over your entire adult life. Every new assignment, every promotion, every deployment, you've been adapting and succeeding. Why would this be different? Her observation was so obvious, so true, that I wondered why I hadn't seen it myself. The skills that had made me effective as a naval officer, adaptability, strategic thinking, leadership under pressure, were exactly what would be required for this new opportunity. There's something else, I said hesitantly. Taking this job would mean acknowledging that my Navy career isn't really over. It would mean staying connected to that world, to those relationships, to that identity. And that's a problem because, Marcus prompted. Because I thought retirement was supposed to be about discovering who I am without the military, I said. But maybe who I am is fundamentally connected to service. Maybe trying to separate myself from that identity is what's been making me feel so lost. Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand, Maybe the point isn't to discover who you are without the Navy. Maybe the point is to discover how to be who you are in a new context. The conversation continued for another hour, ranging from career decisions to family relationships to the challenges of starting over in middle age. By the time we said goodbye, I felt like I had gained something more valuable than just a restored relationship with my sister. I had gained a new perspective on my own life and possibilities. Driving home that night, I made the decision to call Admiral Hawthorne and accept the position. But first, I wanted to do something I hadn't done in years. I wanted to visit Dad's grave. The cemetery in Greenville was quiet on a Thursday morning, with only a groundskeeper visible in the distance. I found Dad's headstone easily, a simple granite marker with his name, dates, and the inscription, Devoted Husband and Father. Mom's matching stone was beside it, their final resting place as understated as their lives had been. I stood there for a long time, thinking about the conversation with Rebecca and Marcus, about the opportunities ahead, about the choices I had made and the ones I was about to make. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I could talk to him without the overwhelming weight of regret. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me," I said quietly. "I know I missed too many important moments. But I think I'm finally understanding what you meant when you said you were proud of me, even when you didn't understand what I was doing." The wind rustled through the oak trees surrounding the cemetery, and I imagined it was his way of responding. "I'm going to take this new job," I continued. "I'm going to keep serving, but in a different way. And I'm going to do better at staying connected to Rebecca, at being the kind of sister who shows up." As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. The guilt that had been my constant companion since Dad's funeral was beginning to lift, replaced by something that felt like hope. The next morning, I called Admiral Hawthorne and accepted the position. The conversation was brief and professional, but I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Excellent decision, Admiral. I think you'll find this work both challenging and rewarding. When can you start?" "I'll need about 6 weeks to relocate and handle personal matters," I said. "Would late August work?" "Perfect. I'll have my staff send you the preliminary materials and contact information for the program coordinators. Admiral Sullivan, I want you to know that this program exists because officers like you paved the way for others. Your experience and insights will be invaluable." After hanging up, I sat in my living room and looked around at the house that had been my retirement refuge for the past year. It was comfortable, quiet, and completely inadequate for the life I was ready to live. I would need to sell it, find a new place near Newport, and once again reconstruct my life around a new mission. But this time, the process felt different. Instead of running away from my past, I was building on it. Instead of trying to discover who I was without the Navy, I was learning how to be who I was in a new context. The phone rang again. This time, it was Rebecca. "Katie, I was just thinking about our conversation last night. I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just for your service, but for who you're becoming in retirement." "I'm taking the job," I told her. "I'm moving to Newport to work with the Naval War College." "That's wonderful," she exclaimed. "I knew you would. You're not someone who can just sit still and be retired. You need to be making a difference." "It means I'll be further away again," I said, suddenly worried about the geographic distance. "But not emotionally further away," Rebecca replied. "We've got phones, we've got email, we've got airplanes. Distance is only a problem if we let it be." She was right, of course. The physical distance between us had never been the real issue. The emotional distance had been the problem, and we were already making progress on that front. "I want to visit Mom and Dad's graves before I move," I said. "Would you like to come with me?" "I'd love that," Rebecca said immediately. "When were you thinking?" "This weekend, if you're free. I went yesterday by myself, but I think it would be good to go together." "Yes," she said firmly. "It's time." Saturday morning, Rebecca drove up from Charleston, and we met at the cemetery. It was her first visit since Mom's funeral 2 years earlier, and I could see the emotions playing across her face as we approached the family plot. "I've been avoiding this," she admitted as we stood before the headstones. "I was so angry after Dad died, and then when Mom passed, I couldn't deal with it." "I understand," I said. "I've been carrying around guilt about not being here when they needed me." "But you were serving," Rebecca said. "You were doing important work that they believed in, even if they didn't always understand it." We spent an hour there, sharing memories, talking about our parents, and acknowledging the ways that grief had driven us apart. It wasn't a magical moment of complete healing, but it was a necessary step in the process of rebuilding our relationship. "I want to be a better sister," Rebecca said as we prepared to leave. "I want to understand your new job, support your work, celebrate your successes." "And I want to be more present," I replied. "I want to be someone you can count on, someone who shows up for the important moments." "Deal," she said, hugging me tightly. As we walked back to our cars, Rebecca asked, "What's your timeline for the move?" "I need to be in Newport by late August. I'll put the house on the market next week, start looking for a place to rent up there. Do you want help with anything? I could come up for a weekend, help you pack or organize." The offer surprised me. We had never done anything like that as adults, never participated in each other's practical life decisions. "I'd like that," I said. "It would be nice to have company." "Then it's settled. Just let me know when you're ready, and I'll be there." Driving home, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. 3 weeks ago, I had been a lonely retiree with no family relationships and no sense of purpose. Now I had a new job that would use my skills and experience, a restored relationship with my sister, and a clearer understanding of who I was and what I wanted to contribute. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it wasn't complete. There would still be challenges ahead: adapting to civilian work culture, building new professional relationships, continuing to strengthen my bond with Rebecca. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward rather than just existing. The following week, I began the practical process of relocating. I contacted a realtor about selling the house, started researching neighborhoods near Newport, and began the administrative process of transitioning from retirement to civilian employment. Each task felt purposeful in a way that my daily routine hadn't for months. Rebecca called several times during the week, ostensibly to check on my progress, but actually to continue the conversations we had been having about my career and our family. She was genuinely curious about the technical aspects of naval operations, asking detailed questions about command structures, operational planning, and the challenges of managing large-scale military exercises. "Marcus says I'm becoming a military history buff," she laughed during one of our calls. "He caught me reading an article about Pacific Fleet operations during your time in command." "What did you think?" I asked. "I thought that my sister was doing incredibly important work that I never bothered to understand," she said. "I'm embarrassed that it took me so long to appreciate what you were accomplishing." "You don't need to be embarrassed," I said. "Military culture is completely different from civilian culture. There was no reason for you to understand it unless you made an effort to learn." "But I should have made that effort," Rebecca insisted. "You were my sister, and I should have cared enough to understand what mattered to you." "We're understanding each other now," I said. "That's what matters." 2 weeks later, I received a call from the Naval War College with more details about the mentorship program. The scope was even broader than I had initially understood. I would be working with senior officers from all branches of the military, not just the Navy, and the curriculum would focus on advanced leadership challenges including inter-service coordination, joint operations, and strategic planning. Admiral Sullivan, the program coordinator, explained, "We've received requests from officers across the fleet asking specifically for your involvement. Your reputation for operational excellence and leadership development is well known throughout the service." It was gratifying to learn that my career had left a positive impression on so many people, but it also felt like a significant responsibility. These officers would be looking to me not just for technical knowledge, but for wisdom about leadership, about balancing competing priorities, about making decisions under pressure. "I'm honored by their confidence," I told the coordinator. "I'll do my best to live up to their expectations." "Based on your service record, I don't think that will be a problem," she replied. "We're looking forward to having you on the team." As August approached, I found myself genuinely excited about the future for the first time in months. The house had sold quickly, I had found a comfortable apartment near the Naval War College, and I had begun reviewing the preliminary materials for the mentorship program. Most importantly, Rebecca and I were building a relationship that felt authentic and sustainable. We talked regularly, shared details about our daily lives, and made plans for her to visit me in Newport once I was settled. "I'm proud of you," she said during one of our calls. "Not just for your military service, but for having the courage to start over, to try something new." "I'm proud of us," I replied, "for figuring out how to be sisters again." 3 days before my move to Newport, Rebecca drove up to help me pack the final boxes. We worked together in companionable silence, wrapping dishes and sorting through belongings, and I was struck by how normal it felt to have her there. "I keep thinking about the wedding," she said as we loaded boxes into the moving truck. "About how different that night could have been if we hadn't been so angry at each other." "But it turned out the way it needed to," I said. "If we hadn't been estranged, Captain Morrison's recognition wouldn't have had the same impact. The whole evening wouldn't have been as meaningful." "Maybe that's true," Rebecca agreed. "Maybe we needed to go through the separation to appreciate what we had." The next morning, as I prepared to leave for Newport, Rebecca hugged me goodbye with a fierceness that reminded me of our childhood. "Don't be a stranger," she said. "Call me when you get there, call me when you start work, call me when you have stories to share." "I will," I promised. "And you call me when you have news, when you need advice, when you just want to talk." "Deal," she said. Driving north toward Rhode Island, I felt like I was embarking on the next chapter of my life rather than simply relocating. The mentorship program would allow me to use my experience to help other officers navigate the challenges of military leadership. My relationship with Rebecca was stronger than it had been in years. I had a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing since my retirement. The woman who had arrived uninvited at her sister's wedding 3 months earlier had been lost, isolated, and struggling to find meaning in civilian life. The woman driving toward Newport was Admiral Catherine Sullivan, ready to serve in a new capacity, connected to family and community, and confident in her ability to make a difference. It had taken a Navy captain's recognition at a wedding reception to remind me who I was and what I had to offer. But sometimes that's how transformation happens, not through careful planning or gradual change, but through unexpected moments that force us to see ourselves clearly. As I crossed the state line into Rhode Island, I called Rebecca to let her know I was making good progress. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like coming home," I said, and for the first time in months I meant it completely. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning that would change everything once again. Admiral Patricia Hendricks, Chief of Naval Personnel, was requesting an urgent video conference about what she termed an unprecedented opportunity for strategic impact. 18 months had passed since I'd started at the Naval War College, and the leadership program had exceeded every benchmark we'd established. Officers from my courses were being promoted at accelerated rates, and commanders across the fleet were specifically requesting graduates for critical assignments. "Admiral Sullivan," Admiral Hendricks began as her image appeared on my secure monitor, "we have a situation that requires your unique expertise. The President has authorized creation of a completely new military institution, the first of its kind in American history." She outlined a classified initiative to establish what would become known as the Defense Leadership Academy, a revolutionary institution designed to prepare senior officers for 21st-century warfare challenges. Unlike traditional service academies, this facility would focus exclusively on strategic thinking, crisis management, and multinational coalition leadership. "The position we're offering is Director of Strategic Education," Admiral Hendricks continued. "You would report directly to the Secretary of Defense and design curricula that will influence military leadership for the next 50 years. The scope was staggering. Students would include brigadier generals, rear admirals, and equivalent ranks from allied nations. The academy would research everything from artificial intelligence integration to space warfare doctrine, while developing leaders capable of commanding in environments that current military doctrine barely addressed." "I'm honored by the consideration," I replied, "but why me specifically?" "Because your officers aren't just performing better, they're thinking differently. They're solving problems that previous leadership development couldn't address. We need someone who can scale that innovation nationally." That evening, I called Rebecca to share the news, expecting to need an extensive explanation about the significance of such an opportunity. "Katie, this is incredible," she exclaimed immediately. "You'd essentially be creating the generals and admirals of the future." "But it would mean relocating to Colorado Springs, starting completely over, building something that's never existed before." "And you've been preparing for exactly this challenge your entire career," Rebecca interrupted. "Remember what Captain Morrison said at my wedding? That your leadership was legendary throughout the service? This is why." Her unwavering confidence in my abilities still amazed me. The sister who had once viewed my military service as selfish ambition now understood it as preparation for contributions she could barely have imagined. There's something else, I continued. This position would make me the highest-ranking woman in military education history. The visibility would be unlike anything I've experienced. Good, Rebecca said firmly. It's about time someone like you had that platform. 3 weeks later, I found myself in the Oval Office as the President signed the executive order establishing the Defense Leadership Academy. Standing behind him as photographers captured the moment, I felt the full weight of the journey that had brought me to this point. Admiral Sullivan represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking our military needs, the President told the assembled media. Her leadership will ensure America's senior officers are prepared for challenges we can't yet imagine. The Academy's construction site in Colorado Springs was a testament to the administration's commitment to revolutionary military education. Ultramodern facilities would house state-of-the-art simulation centers, international conference capabilities, and research laboratories focused on emerging warfare technologies. Rebecca and Marcus flew out for the groundbreaking ceremony, their presence marking another milestone in our rebuilt relationship. Watching them tour the construction site, asking intelligent questions about the Academy's mission and scope, I realized how completely our dynamic had transformed. "This is going to change everything, isn't it?" Rebecca asked as we stood overlooking the sprawling construction zone. "Military leadership education has been essentially unchanged for decades," I explained. "We're creating something that will produce officers capable of commanding in space, cyberspace, and operational environments that don't exist yet." "And you're the person designing how they'll think and lead," Marcus added. "That's an incredible responsibility." The Academy's first semester launched with 48 students representing every branch of the American military plus officers from 12 allied nations. The opening ceremony featured remarks from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, foreign defense ministers, and technology leaders whose companies were revolutionizing warfare capabilities. "Today begins a new era in military leadership development," I told the assembled students and dignitaries. "You are the prototype for a generation of officers who will command in ways previous military leaders couldn't have conceived." My inaugural lecture focused on leadership beyond current doctrine, commanding in undefined operational environments. The audience included generals with combat experience spanning multiple continents, admirals who had commanded carrier strike groups, and international officers whose perspectives reflected diverse strategic cultures. "How many of you have faced situations where existing doctrine provided no guidance?" I asked the auditorium. Every hand rose, exactly as I had anticipated. Effective 21st century leadership requires cognitive agility that transcends traditional military education, I continued. Today, we begin developing frameworks for command decisions in scenarios that current doctrine doesn't address. The curriculum incorporated classified case studies from recent operations, advanced simulation technologies, and guest presentations from leaders across government, industry, and international security organizations. Students engaged with material that challenged fundamental assumptions about military command while building practical capabilities for their current and future positions. British Brigadier General James Crawford approached me after a particularly intensive session on coalition warfare. "Admiral, this program addresses command challenges I've encountered throughout multiple deployments but never had opportunities to explore systematically. Traditional military education focuses on executing existing doctrine," I replied. "We're developing leaders who can create doctrine when none exists." By spring, the Academy was attracting global attention. Delegations from NATO headquarters, Pacific Command, and major defense contractors visited regularly to observe our methodologies. Senior Pentagon officials attended lectures to assess our progress and consider expanding the program internationally. The Academy's first graduation ceremony took place on a perfect May morning, with families and international dignitaries gathered to honor the completion of our inaugural academic year. As I looked out at the graduating class, officers who would soon return to commands worldwide carrying leadership concepts developed over the past 9 months, I felt profound satisfaction. "Today, you join an elite group of military leaders prepared for challenges your predecessors couldn't have imagined," I told the graduates during my commencement address. "More importantly, you represent the future of international military cooperation, officers capable of commanding across technological, cultural, and doctrinal boundaries. Rebecca and Marcus sat in the front row, their faces reflecting pride I was still learning to accept. Behind them were colleagues from Newport, Pentagon officials who had supported the Academy's development, and international observers whose presence demonstrated the program's growing global influence. After the ceremony, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, whose performance had been exceptional throughout the program, approached me during the reception. Admiral, the strategic thinking frameworks we developed here have already influenced how I approach command planning. This education will affect every decision I make for the rest of my career. That's precisely why we created this academy, I replied. Your leadership will influence thousands of people over the coming decades. Ensuring you have advanced cognitive tools isn't just professional development, it's national security. As the reception concluded, Rebecca approached me with an expression I recognized from our childhood, the look she wore when something had particularly impressed her. "Katie, I need you to understand something," she said. "Watching you today, seeing the impact you're having on these officers, understanding the scope of what you've built, I'm not just proud of you as my sister. I'm proud of you as someone whose service continues to strengthen our entire alliance structure." "Thank you," I said, feeling the emotional weight of her words. "And thank you for being here, for supporting this work, for helping me remember who I am and what I'm capable of." Walking toward the parking area with Rebecca and Marcus, past graduates still celebrating with their families, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. The uninvited guest at her sister's wedding had been transformed not by recognition itself, but by remembering that service takes many forms, and that leadership can be exercised wherever there are challenges worth addressing. "You know what I find most remarkable about all this?" Marcus asked as we reached our cars. "What's that?" 3 years ago, you felt like your useful life was over. Now you're literally designing how America's senior military leaders will think and operate for the next generation. That's not just a career change, that's a complete transformation of impact and influence." He was absolutely right. The woman who had drifted through retirement feeling irrelevant had become Admiral Catherine Sullivan once again, but this time with the wisdom to understand that her most significant contributions might extend far beyond anything she had accomplished during active duty. "I keep thinking about that moment at the wedding when Captain Morrison recognized you," Rebecca said. "It's like that evening gave you permission to be yourself again, and everything since then has been building on that foundation." "More than that," I replied. "That evening reminded me that service doesn't end with retirement. It just evolves into new forms. And sometimes those new forms can have an even greater impact than what came before." Standing in the Colorado Springs sunshine, looking back at the academy that would soon graduate officers capable of commanding in space, cyberspace, and operational environments that previous generations couldn't have imagined, I understood with perfect clarity that my story was far from over. The Defense Leadership Academy was thriving, my relationship with Rebecca was stronger than ever, and I was contributing to national security in ways that honored everything I had learned during my naval career while preparing future leaders for challenges none of us could fully anticipate. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that recognition and reconciliation can catalyze transformations we never thought possible. Sometimes an unexpected encounter at a wedding reception can remind us who we really are and what we're truly capable of achieving. The uninvited guest had found her way home, and the journey was just beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.